So Joe Gilliam just introduced himself, Unity in Disasters. Joe Gilliam, you want to give a little bit of recap of what you shared, the most important parts, what you want to do?
Sure. Do you want me to kind of repeat what I said or
Yes,
recap
sir.
one?
Yeah, you can
Okay,
repeat.
so, okay, great. So the three things that I've outlined was one, that I was a first responder, law enforcement for 7 years, beginning with the United States Air Force. The second one that I think I would like everyone to know is that I had 5 years working in the substance abuse field towards my certification as a substance abuse counselor. That allowed me to understand, do no further harm, the needs of how some of the mental health challenges and the trauma. The first one I didn't, item which was in law enforcement, that helped me to realize the intricate specifics of first responding. And the last item I mentioned is that because I'm a man of God, my convictions are solid, bold, yet humble.
Thank you. I appreciate you for extending me some grace on that. And I will pass it over to Dr. Campbell next, Dr. Nania Campbell, if you want to tell us what's the most important for folks to know about you.
All right, sure. Thank you, Dr. Martin. That's hard to follow, but I'll just introduce myself as a disaster researcher and most importantly, a sociologist. So my perspective that I bring, I'm always interested in looking at systems and how those pre-existing conditions in our communities that create an inequality on a day-to-day basis play out during disasters. That's the lens that I bring to my work. And specifically, also that I am executive director at the Bill Anderson Fund, which is a nonprofit organization that works on expanding the number of underrepresented minorities in hazards and disaster-related fields. So I'm education adjacent in addition to being a researcher and an applied researcher. I'm really concerned with making sure that the disaster field reflects the American society, reflects the communities that are most directly affected by disasters. I don't think that we can make progress through research. We can write up all the guidance we want unless there are more of us who come from the communities who are facing the most dire consequences from disasters in the decision-making spaces, making policy, conducting the research, acting as practitioners in the field. And so I'm really committed to making sure that it's not just those few of us out there, but that we're all lifting as we ascend within this field into those roles and preparing a workforce that is equipped to actually bring those lived experiences to the fore and to develop their policies, their practices, their approaches to their work in ways that are responsive to the everyday lived experiences of the communities they're serving. So that's kind of all the different lenses that I'm applying to my work in the disaster field and the kinds of collaborations I'm trying to build.
Thank you so much, Dr. Campbell. Appreciate you. And last but not least, and then I will introduce myself, is Dr. Anel Prim.
Hello, everyone. So I'd like to introduce myself as a psychiatrist, but a community psychiatrist, which is sort of a different category. And what that means is that as a community psychiatrist, I'm not going to lay you down on a couch and analyze you. My interest is engaging with people of all walks of life in the community to address solutions to some of the common challenges that we face. And so the way that has played out in my work is in particular with the All Healers Mental Health Alliance, which has been together since Katrina in 2005 and was designed to facilitate culturally appropriate responses to the mental health needs of Black and other communities that exist in marginalized spaces that are affected by both natural and human-caused disasters. And so the partners who are part of that work and facilitation are first responders like Joe Gilliam, faith leaders, people in health fields, nursing, psychology, social work, et cetera. And even engineers have been at our table. And so we and community activists and advocates, everyone has something to contribute to the brainstorming and strategizing that it takes to join with communities to figure out what can we do to help reduce the stress that's associated with disasters, which are coming fast and furious, especially in parts of the country that have very large populations of people who look like us. I'll just stop there. I guess I just want to say one more thing, that what we end up facilitating may not be mental health care per se, but it may be meeting very basic needs that that people need in order to function and be okay, you know, even in the midst of a disaster. So whatever that takes, especially engaging with the communities that are affected, letting them lead us as to what they need, what they want, and how, that is what I am guided by. So I'm a part of the team. The egos stay at the door, you know, so that's how I'd like to introduce myself.
Thank you so much for that, Dr. Prim. I appreciate you. And everyone who has introduced themselves. And so I will round us out by introducing myself briefly, but also kind of talking a little bit about the Black Resilience Network before we jump into our official set of questions. And so the most important thing to know about me, and I often say this, so some people might be tired of hearing me say this, is that my husband and I grew up in Boston, born and raised, that we have 5 children, 2 still at home, 3 out in the world, and 4 grandbabies with 1 on the way. And so life is real and full, and much of what I've learned about emergency management, resilience, and all that stuff, racial justice, really came from trying to figure out how to manage a family with everything else that I was trying to do professionally. And one of the professionally, I spent most of my career in the Homeland Security emergency management space, and then partially in what they call resilience, which is kind of a combination of lots of different things, understanding the preconditions that communities are dealing with and people are dealing with, and how that influences the way they experience extreme events. And then what does that mean for what we should be doing now? What response, recovery, climate action, what all of that should look like given that context. And practically speaking, I've oversaw the public health and healthcare response and recovery efforts for the marathon bombings for the city of Boston when I was a director of public health preparedness, and a number of other incidents that were not national in scope. And so I have this practitioner mind, and then I also have this academic mind, and then I've always considered myself a community member, right? So I am a community member first, no matter what role or position that I have. And so that really defines how I approach the work and the work that I do, including as the executive director of Next Leadership Development, which convenes the Black Resilience Network, which segues me into just a super quick overview before we jump in to our official questions. And so I'm going to do the awkward transition to slides thing, and then we will jump into our conversation. So for Next Leadership Development, as conveners of the Black Resilience Network, it really aligns with our overarching mission as an organization. And so for the Black Resilience Network, our mission is to catalyze leadership development, collaborations, and investments in Black communities, towns, and organizations so they can play their vital roles in the disaster and climate resilience ecosystem. And so the idea here is acknowledging that communities have been doing this work. They are the ones community organizations, community leaders that have been designated by the community as such, are folks who will be there for the community beforehand. When emergencies happen, they're the ones who jump into action. And then during the recovery phase, they're the ones who jump into action. But it doesn't necessarily mean that they're on anyone's radar screen or that they're actually receiving resources associated with response and recovery efforts, or what it takes to build capacity and capabilities to actually fully play that role in a way that's going to help them be most impactful in their communities. For context, I skipped a slide there. Oh, there we go. Our founding members are here on the screen, and actually 3 of our panelists today are founding members, and then Joe Gilliam is a member of the Black Resilience Network, and we're very excited to have him as a part of the family, given everything that he said and the work that he's doing. But really, this was born out of a collective and looking forward to building out our partnerships as well as our priority areas. So I won't go into the weeds on this, but what I will say is that in February of this year, we launched our priority areas and priorities, which are not on the screen, the specific details of the priorities because it's long, but really laying out for historic and cultural preservation, what our position on it is, how important it is to overall disaster and climate resilience, and the things that we can do from an initiatives perspective as the Black Resilience Network, to model ways that we can operationalize those priorities that we laid out. And so on here, you have some examples of initiatives, the categories, priority areas, and then the supporting initiatives. One thing I will call out explicitly is the Emergency Operations Center, because it is up and running. We did our climate resilience roundtable at the White House in February. We were up and running with the Emergency Operations Center to support the Mississippi tornado that happened in March. And so just like that, we were kind of put into action and have realized so much over that time. And I'm sure Dr. Prim will talk about some of those things that we've realized during that time. And I'll just briefly mention the other priority areas: disaster mitigation and preparedness, and then disaster workforce and business development. One thing you will notice that we don't say climate in all of them all the time, mainly because we've baked those ideas in there. The ideas that when we're thinking about disaster mitigation, preparedness, response, recovery, workforce, and business development, in addition to historic and cultural preservation, that we're thinking about what are the climate actions that are relevant in those areas that we can bake in, both mitigation as well as on the adaptation side. So I'm going to stop sharing for time's sake, and say thank you for allowing me just that moment to ground us. And I'm just dropping into the chat the link to the Black Resilience Network for you to learn more about that. And so with all of that said, we're going to kick this off with our first question. So you introduced yourselves, you kind of gave a little bit of insights into, into your positions on this, but what are some of the challenges you see with the ways that we're currently discussing preparedness, specifically community preparedness and individual preparedness? And let's kick this off with Joe Gilliam.
Thank you. So I really took the time to give some of this information some thought. One of the things I believe the challenge is the best practices that are dated back 15 years, 20 years. I think that the challenge is the community needs to be open-minded to the fact that there are enough obstacles and change within a community and society, often enough to where we can't or we should not just assume best practices from 10 years ago are applicable today. And I think I've been doing, I think I'm going on, this is the 15th year for Unity in Disasters. And I didn't agree with the best practices on year one because I didn't think that they applied, and just because of how I view things. But that's one of them I think should really, and I don't have to give examples because we all know that not only did COVID change everything in how we do business and a variety of other issues from mental health to the economy, but even some of the social issue justice received a lot of highlight during that period. So there are a lot of different aspects that they're going, but I think that's really one that I think has some challenges. I know I've been involved with the VOAD, the Voluntarily Organizations Active in Disasters, if for some of you who are familiar with it. And that's one thing, that the way the disaster relief community and also the emergency management, they do use, you put policies in place and you just can't change them overnight. You also have to realize you have to give them a chance to play out their cycle. But then the politics involved with it at times and who's in charge. So there's a variety of issues, but the point is just be open to change because of social media, technology, and some of the other aspects. Best practices just need to be reviewed every 3 or 4 years. And I think that's just a good place to start. And the second obstacle, I believe, is the media coverage and talking points versus the reality. The media, and we all probably can attest this, you see the media, they'll do those interviews and highlights of an event of what's going on, to where they don't want to ruffle feathers, they want to get views, all these other reasons for having the interview, everything from where they interview at to who they interview, what they talk about. And then you have, again, as I mentioned, and the talking points, of course. And then again, you have the reality of the underserved communities and Black communities that are really suffering, that are not mentioned in these talking points. So you can have a media coverage that will come in, an example, 30 days after disasters and say, oh, things are getting better. They'll bring out all the good things to make it, to make it appear that, things are going well. In a lot of cases they are, but in my opinion, they really need to highlight the things that are not going well for those people who are already underserved and struggling. So we call, and Dr. Martin is probably familiar with this term, we call there people who are self-sufficient, that can work their way out of disasters. They have bank accounts, they have family, they have jobs, they have 401ks, some even have 2 homes. They have enough structure and resources to weather the storm, so to speak. But then you have that community who are living paycheck to paycheck on social services, may not have a vehicle, single parent families, mental health issues. Those people, a major weather event really throws them off. And I really got involved with this. It's funny because I was doing substance abuse, and I understood to a certain degree how those people that were in recovery, when they didn't have their support system, how much they suffered during major events. So there's a lot of little parts, and it depends on what you're exposed to, what information that you have that's actual and factual makes a difference.
Thank you so much for that, Mr. Gilliam. And so, you're raising this point of the lack of attention and to the nuances of real people's lives and how that plays out in their experiences. And so I'm going to pass it over to Dr. Prim to kind of build on that from her experiences. And then we'll go to Dr. Campbell next to talk about some of the research implications and how that relates to some of the things that we're talking about now.
So one of the challenges that I see, around how we think and talk about disaster preparedness, especially for Black communities and other communities that exist in marginalized spaces, is that, we're kind of assuming that people aren't living in an ongoing smoldering disaster. That's like the background. And And then whenever something else happens, that just kind of superimposes, additional stress and hardship and adversity. And so it's made me recognize the importance of our communities acknowledging the resources and the richness that we do have. I mean, we have each other. We tend to be collective people. And I've learned from being a part of the All Healers Mental Health Alliance is that coming together on a regular basis and developing relationships with each other and knowing a little bit about each other's networks, that's kind of, if all communities could do that, that could be very important for whatever additional disaster will come their way. And this is connected to what disaster researchers have found, that the thing that brings about mental health in communities after disasters are 5 main things: to create a sense of calm, to create a sense of safety, to remind people that even with the disaster going on, they can still do things themselves and carry on with their lives, and they can work with their family members, neighbors, et cetera, and do things collectively, to keep moving forward. And then also, such an important aspect of that is connectedness, not to be isolated, to be in connection with other people, and then finally to have a sense of hope. And so I think we should not ignore those things pre, during, and post disaster as things that can help to to bring about, a coherent way of dealing with disasters when they come, having that kind of sense of community and collaboration that is so critical. I mean, really in everything we do, especially for our communities.
Thank you for that, Dr. Prim. Appreciate you. All right, Dr. Campbell. So, you have your own experiences in addition to the amazing breadth of research you have been exposed to. Same question for you, which is, what are some of the ways that we keep misstepping on how we talk about preparedness, or particularly community preparedness?
I think you all have hit a lot of really important issues on the head. And I really the first thing that comes to mind is returning to something that you started off this conversation with, and that's this idea that we have this hyper individualistic frame that emphasizes personal responsibility in a way that's often really obscures a lot of the shortcomings and frankly failures of the systems we already have in place to support people during times of disaster. And so, again, as a sociologist, I'm concerned with those systems that create inequality in a social structure on a day-to-day basis. And what we see is that those pre-existing conditions become amplified during times of disaster. And we have to acknowledge that there are already these sources of inequality, and we're also dealing with systems that do not treat people equitably. So we have to be aware that these systems are not meeting the needs of Black communities and other marginalized communities before disasters, and that gets exacerbated during times of crisis. So we need to be focusing on how we're developing preparedness guidance and whether or not that actually addresses the context that people are living in on a day-to-day basis. So, how are you supposed to have an evacuation plan if you lack access to transportation? There needs to be additional support for that. Or if you don't have access to stable housing, all of those things are really important for whether someone can use the guidance that we're pushing out to them to actually prepare. And if we're not giving them the supports that they need to be able to do that, then we're robbing them of the agency that they do have. We have to, and this also, I think, builds on the point that Dr. Prim was making around how do we make sure that we're giving people the tools to expand the sources of resilience that they already have, the ways that they already support their own existence on a day-to-day basis, and strengthen those areas. We have to work with the support systems people already rely on. And in many ways, that is the communities that they're involved in. Who are you turning to watch your kids when you have to go to work? Who are you asking to help you make those extra few dollars you need for rent or asking for a ride? And so how do we strengthen those networks rather than asking marginalized people to build entirely new ones? So I think that's really important. And we have to make sure that the people responsible for disaster planning are bringing that lens into the guidance that they're developing and the supports that they're building. And so that's why I think from my perspective as someone who's investing in the disaster workforce, this is why representation matters. We have to have folks who are even aware of what day-to-day life looks like for people who are often excluded from decision-making, so that they can be raising questions when we have a system that doesn't work, when we have protocols and processes and hoops that people have to jump through that aren't accessible to them. And that's just baked in as an assumption that they have access to certain things. And if we can do that and invest in bringing in folks who actually know what they're talking about when they're doing community engagement, we can really move the needle, I think, on giving people the tools that they actually need to be prepared for disasters, rather than pushing stuff out to them that's not really relevant.
Thank you for that. And it's interesting, kind of all three of you bringing up the inequities and the things that kind of just often go ignored for the easy pathway forward. And one of the things that when we think about preparedness, in my mind is everything you all have said, right? The relationships, making sure that there are resources available. Mr. Gilliam also talked about kind of the media. And here's kind of one of the, to Mr. Gilliam's point, one of the implications of the media piece that I want to just kind of lift up because of some recent meetings and conversations that I've had. One is there is a direct correlation between media coverage and money raised for disasters. So the way we cover a disaster is how much is correlated with how much money is raised. So the disasters we cover in a limited way, we don't focus on, that means those communities aren't getting funded. The way we frame where the recovery is, so if we think that everything's all good, then folks don't think that they need to invest any additional resources there. And so, as we think about preparedness, also thinking about the implications of where resources come for people to be prepared, but also for response and recovery. So I just wanted to flag that. And then also, as we are thinking about the community capabilities, capacities, strengths, brings me to kind of my next question around, you all have been touching disaster management, disaster response, recovery efforts for many years. And so from your perspective, what are some of the key experiences that influence your response? And the goal here is to be able to share some tangible moments or moment where you were like, okay, this experience therefore helps me to better understand that, moving forward, I should really be making sure that I'm advocating for for communities to do this, or for emergency management to be doing that. So just to contextualize it a little bit. So I'm going to stay in the same order and just come to Joe, Mr. Gilliam.
Okay, so I had two things. One is there's about 10%. I guess this study was about maybe 7 years old. There's about 10 to 11% of people that actually fall through the cracks of the recovery efforts, according to FEMA. What that means is there are a lot of people who do not get the services, do not have the attention, the support, etc. Unity in Disasters was actually founded on what's left to be done. Because one of the things that I realized when I first outlined our program was I noticed that we didn't want to line up with other groups were doing. So our niche was what's left to be done. And lo and behold, as time went on, we realized that there are a lot of people who do fall through the cracks. It could be in there in their marginalized communities, their undocumented communities. And that's a lot of people when you have a big event. And there have been a lot of, whether it be Sandy, whether it be Katrina, whether it be Harvey, there are a lot of people that were affected in those areas. And that was one of the driving factors where at the beginning, I partnered with another group, and we intentionally tried to identify communities that were left out. We were looking for people who were not near where all the resources were given away at the large mega church, where you only so many of the population that was affected lives near there. Like I said, they don't have transportation to get there, whether it be information, resources. So we really started focusing on these people that were left out, that either didn't trust the government, didn't want to be bothered with the government. They didn't trust FEMA, all these issues. So we try to make sure that those people, for one, especially when Unity and Disasters, saw people of color coming in to help them, which can help to some degree. For those who are not, have a hardened heart, they are open to, and if you have lived in some of those environments, you understand the lingo to talk, and you kind of just, they're family. So you're not viewed as an outsider. So that's one thing. The other part is that another thing that's driving me is understanding really up front, when I was in Atlanta, about the bureaucracy behind resources. That really forced me to really intentionally come up with a strategy that I was going to sit quietly in as many meetings as I could to hear the truth. And once I heard the truth and knew this is how things operated, then I was going to be able to be effective.
Thank you so much for that. Appreciate you for sharing that experience. Dr. Prim?
I can think of two examples that illustrate this point about, networks and relationships, before the disaster. And one in particular is, you all remember the Buffalo shooting in May of 2022, which was just horrible. And the All Healers Mental Health Alliance engaged with a number of people on the ground in Buffalo, and for months after that disaster. And then there was a horrible snowstorm, which happened maybe 6-7 months later. And a number of people died, and the ones that died, I understand there was a disproportionate number that were from the Black community in Buffalo. And what we learned is that many of the Black folks who died, I guess they didn't get the information that they shouldn't go out, with the snow being so bad. And the people who survived that were connected on Facebook. And so it was just kind of everyday people on Facebook, who shared information about, like, don't go out. I mean, even maybe before there were messages that people received on TV or on the radio. And so that made me realize that that is a resource that is in our hands as a community. And, I'm not a big Facebook person. Like I guess I have a profile on there, but I know a lot of people that's like their lifeline. And so, for everyday people to have the power of that kind of communication in their hands, perhaps sharing information, on Black Facebook, if there's such a thing, in a given community, that might have saved some people. And I'm, just mindful of us, utilizing the communication tools that we have. There was another one another example that I was going to bring up. I hope I haven't lost it. But I guess just staying connected and again, sharing information in our networks is critical. I think the All Healers Mental Health Alliance is a good example of that. People are all over the country. They have networks of their own, and whenever something happens, we're able to, to tap into that. And, I'm hoping that some of the things that I learned as a process of being involved with the Mississippi response, I heard things from people who live in communities that have been hit by 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 sets of tornadoes. They were saying things like, well, why don't they build storm shelters, especially for the seniors, so that they have some place to go that's safe, because many of the people in those communities are living in mobile housing units, and they are known to be vulnerable to some of these severe weather events. And anyway, I think I'm getting a little bit off topic here about the relationship piece, but the relationships allow for information sharing and hopefully, result in people listening to folks in the community who are on the ground, who know what's going on. Hopefully that does filter to, as Dr. Campbell was saying, decision makers who really take that information to heart and make the changes that would help to protect people better.
Thank you so much, Dr. Prim. Dr. Campbell.
I do want to just drive home that first point that Dr. Prim was making that's really very well validated in the research about communicating through the channels that people use on a day-to-day basis and leveraging those leaders, those natural networks that already exist. I think that is crucially important. And that's the success stories that we see are when that has happened, just like the example that she gave from Buffalo, where people are able to check in through the places they're already checking in and not being forced to go somewhere different, that they're hearing those messages from people they already trust. That's really important and a vital part of preparedness, of response, just pushing out important information to communities in a way that's also more likely to fit the context that they live in every day too. So I think that's really important. And then as taking the thread from Mr. Gilliam, I think that working through those community organizations that are finding alternative ways around the systems that don't always work well for our communities is really important too. And a lot of the examples that I've found most inspiring through my research has been those when there's the senior center that takes up the mantle of helping seniors navigate this maze of bureaucracy for applying for FEMA aid, helping them get all their paperwork together, and using the computer to submit all of the forms that now have to be submitted online. That kind of thing is really important. And if there are community organizations where people are already going for services and for, just gathering on a day-to-day basis, those are the success stories that I've really seen where whether it's navigating the systems that exist, that's really important because then they feel that they can trust the person that's helping them with it or get that support they need to feel empowered to submit an appeal, for example, when they're denied for reasons they can't understand or that are unclear. That kind of stuff is really, that kind of support is really important. But also when local groups and organizations develop their own programs to meet their community's needs, because the resources that are being provided through official sources that are designated as responsible for responding to disasters aren't cutting it and aren't compatible with what the residents actually need. So for example, one of the fellows with the Bill Anderson Fund just completed a project where she was looking at community grassroots organizations and how they stepped in to provide food services during the pandemic. And one of the things that she found that it wasn't large food banks, it wasn't established food pantries, but in some cases it was after school organizations, that had after school programming that then pivoted towards meeting people's food needs because that's what they were seeing, because they were plugged into their community. They were from those communities. We're talking about Black folks who understand what Black folks need and are struggling with because they are living in it. That were really pivoting then to support some of those specific needs that they were seeing, and addressing the fact that other services weren't accessible. And they were being really nimble about it, right? They just they saw a need, and so they figured out how to address it. And sometimes they would partner with other organizations to compete, because sometimes they were then in competition with larger organizations that had more access to resources to get the food that their communities need. Recognizing that, sometimes their seniors were getting food boxes that had foods they couldn't chew, those kinds of things that they recognized that they needed to step in and fill a gap. And I think we need to be directing more resources to those smaller organizations that know their communities, and helping them build capacity to do more of that, instead of having emergency managers go and ask them to sit down and spend time with them and figure out what to do, right? We can't ask people to take on more responsibility and more work for free, but we can empower them to expand what they're already doing and experts in doing.
You're shaking. No, thank you so much for that. I appreciate it. And it's interesting. But before I say what's interesting, I'm going to hand it over to Dr. Prim, because she put her hand up and there's something that's burning. So let's go, Dr. Prim.
Oh, thank you. I just remembered what it was I was going to say, and some of the things that Dr. Campbell mentioned triggered the thought. And that is during the Selma tornadoes that hit, I think in December or January, because of the networks that All Healers had established and of the Black Family Summit had established, because we are members of each other's organizations. There's like a matrix going on, really. But because of that, when those tornadoes happened, we got together and started talking, and we thought that many people in the communities might not have the capacity to apply for FEMA resources. And so there was a organization connected to the Black Family Summit that was in Selma, the Selma Center for Nonviolence, Truth, and Reconciliation, which had a group of volunteers who, we came up with this idea, let's train a bunch of volunteers to, go out into the community or hold clinics, Saturday clinics on successive Saturdays after the tornado occurred, to sit down with people with a tablet and walk through the FEMA process with them, for them. And in order to prepare the volunteers for that, we tapped into the All Healers Network again, and Joe Gilliam, who had done a lot of training on these issues and had a colleague, a social worker, who had, done a lot of disaster case management. And we came together to create a just-in-time training for these volunteers, to then go out and help the community access resources that we knew that they were going to need, but we knew that there were barriers. Perhaps people might not have access to the internet, or, might not know how to navigate a government system, and might just throw their hands up and say, you know what, I don't even want to deal with all that. That's too much. And then we also, a part of the training was, what to do if you get a denial letter, how to appeal, just to give people a sense of hope that there was a way that they could get resources. But that all came out of our pre-existing relationships, where we were able to come together in short order to do this, like within a week after that disaster happened. I was just amazed by that. But we were just fortunate that those pre-existing relationships allowed to mount a response specifically to what we knew people were going to need. So just wanted to give that as an example.
And that was a very strong example. And you actually, lift up this piece around the role of individuals in communities, the role of community-based organizations, and this idea of, I usually say this, I don't know if this is the best way to say it, but this idea of making sure we do what we can with what we have, right? Always doing what we can with what we have. And I think also making sure that we're advocating for what we deserve, right? And that there's this tightrope walk that we're doing. And even when it comes to preparedness, what are the types of resources that should be invested in community-based organizations in order to be able to actually step into those roles during response and recovery? What are the ways that the traditional VOAD or voluntary organizations active in disasters, like what is what the relationships that they need to be creating within their states with folks who are outside of the traditional VOAD network? We know that they get overtapped. We've been on calls with VOADs where they've had to deal with so many different disasters in such a compressed amount of time. They don't have the capacity to do it and become overwhelmed. And the logical evolution of that would be that we would be then coordinating with community-based organizations who are the context experts on what's happening in communities that can make sure that whatever resources folks need, that it's done in a way that will actually support communities in how they need it. So thank you all for framing that. And then we're starting to get into some specific recommendations now, right? So Dr. Prim, your example started to get to a specific recommendation of, in order for us to be more prepared, right? Here are the types of things we need to be doing through the lens of that example you gave. So in addition to, well, let me reframe and just ask the question. What is it that we do recommend happen, right? So we talked about the challenges, we talked about what we've experienced, but like what should be happening when it comes to preparedness, given all that we have discussed up to this point. And so I'm going to stay in the same order to keep it predictable. Mr. Gilliam.
Okay, so I hope this isn't too much over the top. However, I believe that we need to push to organize Black national preparedness groups. All the other national groups, most of them are faith-based, so they have a pool of volunteers from churches, whether the United Methodists, the Presbyterians, AME in some cases. They have 30 to 50 churches in each state. They have a pool of volunteers, so they can organize. And they do at times, I guess. But it's important because there are enough groups, whether it be HBCUs, it could be sororities, it could be fractions. There's enough groups of people of color that we can really, if we're serious, and I think it's not that we're not serious, there just needs to be a driving force for this initiative, period. And maybe a public spokesperson. It's probably not going to be me because it's just not. But maybe a celebrity, someone needs to push the idea that, like you said, we're talking about the disservices all the way back from Katrina. And to this day, there hasn't been a conscious effort for a group to really respond to the Black community. There are a lot of people who are mentioning in different silos what they think should happen at the local level, which is good. But the problem with that is those local groups, they're only going to do their part. As an example, let's use a church for an example. If you have an AME church that's going to help a disaster area that's affected 50,000 people, they're going to look after their church members first and probably their immediate community. They're not going to really look out for the Black community because sometimes churches don't operate that. They work on faith-based, not color, not people of color. So that's the disconnect when it comes to that. So I think there just needs to be a real push to bring a couple of groups together and say, hey, this group we're going to take care, and let me circle back. This is only for coastal communities. We're not talking about a group in Nebraska. We don't need one in Wyoming. We don't need one in Washington State. I'm talking about the coastal groups that has all the hurricanes, tornadoes, and flooding. Let's start with that. Example, we have a group in North Carolina or Virginia say we're going to cover these 2-3 states. We have another group based out of North Carolina say we're going to cover South Carolina and Georgia. And just organize to help the Black community based on Black groups. And I don't know why, I don't think it's rocket science. I just don't think there's enough ongoing push and initiative of how important it really is. And the numbers are out there, how many people are suffering because it's not there. So that's one thing. And the other one was, like Dr. Prim mentioned, the Mississippi. Now I work with they have what they call the Mississippi Rapid Response, and we helped them out 2 years ago at one disaster. I forgot. We're on our 13th disaster in 15 years. So at some point, I'm starting to kind of, I remember them, but I don't remember some of the smaller ones, but I know the ones that we help in. But my point is, Rukia in Mississippi, they have what they call a rapid response group. And they put together a group in Mississippi where they'll go to Louisiana, Alabama, and they'll take care of within that 100 miles. So they've done it for just that one area, but there's still a lot of other areas that could use that same concept if someone was willing to actually implement it and take the lead on it and just form a committee, you know, whatever it takes. We shouldn't be on the shoulders of any one person or any one group, but form a committee that really puts this in place and do it, you know, pilot by pilot, piece by piece. And that I believe we'll end up a little bit further than what we are now. And that's the whole point.
Thank you so much, Mr. Gilliam. I'm going to pass it over to Dr. Prim. I'm not even going to say anything because I think your first recommendation and then how it fed into your second recommendation is aligned with things we've been discussing and putting into practice and doing with the Black Resilience Network. So I'm going to pass it over to Dr. Prim.
Yes, thank you, Dr. Martin. Joe, I was very inspired by what you said. And as you described the need for, a national Black, disaster focused organization, I was just thinking like, well, why not the Black Resilience Network? We have some of the elements, already in place and, a big vision. And so I think, with you describing it that way, I have to admit, I don't think I was thinking of the Black Resilience Network quite like that, but I think that is should be our agenda and hopefully, hopefully others will get on board. But I think we all know that there may be some challenges and barriers to people coming together like that, because everybody thinks maybe their idea or their approach is the best, and they want to be known for that and they want to lead with that, and they may not want to to work collectively because maybe that doesn't shine as big a light on them as they are looking for. But if we could continue to attract organizations with a similar agenda like we have aligned ourselves with, I think we could be that, so and because really no one organization can do it all, and as we know, there's enough need to go around, maybe more than what we can fill. But I think together, the more organizations that we join hands with to take this challenge on, the better. So.
Thank you, Dr. Prim. Dr. Campbell?
It's hard to add much to that because I do think that this fits very squarely within the wheelhouse of what we are building with the Black Resilience Network. But if there's one thing, from a different lens that I could recommend, then it would be the investment of resources in something like the Black Resilience Network or the member organizations there, right? The decision makers, those are the kinds of efforts that you can direct resources to, so that, returning to the point that I made earlier, you're not asking the same folks who are already filling in these gaps, working on shoestring budgets, working at over hours and after hours on top of the other things that they were already doing. If you could invest in their capacity to join something like the Black Resilience Network and to take on those additional duties for helping their communities prepare for disaster, if you're going to make those requests, then invest in that capacity for that to happen. Whether, if you're not in control of the purse strings and you can't direct funding, maybe there's technical assistance you can provide, knowing that a lot of these groups are just a few people working on something really hard to support their communities and maybe don't have the time to submit those grant applications. Providing that additional support within your means as an organization, as a director of an organization, or someone within some kind of organization at the community level that's trying to bring them into the fold, then support them how you can and support the development of them as part of a network so that they can draw on each other as well.
Thank you for that, Dr. Campbell. And Joe Gilliam raised his hand, and he was smiling when he raised his hand. So this is going to be good, y'all. All right, Dr. Gilliam.
So I just wanted to say, I would not dare say that this is what you or any group should be doing, because I cringe at board meetings when we get done with the board meeting with my group. I have a to-do list and they're going about their business. And I've been really conscientious of putting things on people's plate, because the 20% of the people are doing 100% of the work. So I'm really conscientious of that. But it's not the group, it's just the concept. There has to be buy-in to that concept, and it has to be buy-in to that concept for the purpose of serving Black communities. And since it's already been said, yes, I think the Black Resilient Network is a great foundation for it to for something like that to happen. I'm going to leave it there because I think my next comment might be in your next question, so I'll leave it at that.
Well, you might as well flow us right into it. Round us
Okay.
out. We'll just swing it right back around, sir.
Since you asked, we're not doing enough in response to help us address recovery. And what I mean by that is, you have delivery of services in recovery, you have delivery of services. Unity in Disasters, this is our 15th year. We didn't help over 17,000 families up until 2020. And when Jerry Collins, who retired from FEMA after 10 years, wrote an article about us called the VOAD movement, he identified us as the only national disaster relief response group, the only disaster relief group that was Black-led. No other Black-led in the country. This was 4 years ago when he wrote the article. So since then, but what gave us that reputation was because of response. Response helped us realize what was actually needed. By being there after the first week, you realize you can identify the communities that need help and exactly what they need. You can identify from that particular community, because the communities change. You can be in Mississippi one day, Alabama the next day, Georgia. So the communities change, the elected officials change, the characteristics of the entire demographics are different. So, but the response when you're helping them with those basic needs, which is what we tapped into at the very beginning, getting truckloads of food and half a truckload of Pampers and a variety of different things that drew people in so we could communicate with them and see what they really need. But we also saw where a lot of communities were being left out because we were actually there. Now, to come in and try to assess a community by someone else's assessment is tricky, because they're just giving you their version of it. And they're more than likely, we're not sure what they're leaving out, but the question is, are they leaving out what's important to you? And that's where I think the connection between this group understanding, being involved with the response, really will open up their eyes to what's needed in recovery, and they can be more efficient by doing that. The last thing I'll mention is I take climate seriously because I had the unique experience of being stationed in Alaska. When I was stationed in Alaska many years ago, that's when all those mountains were full of ice. Those mountains that had ice for thousands of years don't have ice anymore. So I don't have to watch a documentary to know that climate change is real, it's happening, and how it's affecting. That's part of the reason why I got involved with disaster relief, because I realized back in the early 90s that this was going on, but it wasn't a big deal then, because those tornadoes and flooding hadn't hit the states yet. But the climate change was slowly happening, because I had some friends and family in Alaska, and we would talk about it. So I'm one of the people that I just wanted to mention that I understand climate change. I take it real seriously, because I believe it firsthand. And it's not because of what I've told, it's because of what I've seen and know the difference.
Thank you so much, Mr. Gilliam. Dr. Prem, we're what is it that's most important for folks to walk away understanding from this conversation?
I think the importance of relationships that are formed and nurtured prior to a disaster, prior to, during, and networks, tapping into our natural networks, and using the communication channels that people naturally use, to communicate information about disasters is really critical. And I also think that that really tapping into the local knowledge, maybe this didn't come up before, but I did want to tack this on, of community members. They know their community, they know what's happened. Sometimes they know what happened 100 years ago, and the same thing is happening again, or 50 years ago, like, with Hurricane Ian hitting Immokalee, which is the town that I believe Zora Neale Hurston, the famous anthropologist and writer, that's where she came from, and wrote her book, Their Eyes Were Watching God, about that, the storm that hit that community and devastated them, maybe close to 100 years ago. And then the same situation repeated again where the people were struggling. Anyway, the importance of listening to people who have local knowledge. Let's not forget that. Sometimes we're so focused on community leaders, quote unquote, who are recognized as such and who may have the mic, or the limelight. The everyday people on the ground, they also know a lot. And we need to find out, where do they see the gaps? Just like LaWanda Fluker of Mississippi, who said, why don't they have storm shelters for the seniors so they can have some place safe to go, when the tornadoes are coming? Because some people don't have a place to go. They give warnings like, if you're living in a mobile housing unit, once the storm watch comes, you need to be making your way to a stable structure, I guess with bricks and mortar. But maybe people don't have a place to go like that. So anyway, just some of the wisdom is going to come, directly from community members on the ground. Let's not forget that, to hear those voices.
Thank you, Dr. Prem. Dr. Campbell.
I think for me, it's just seeking to support the strengths that are already there and help to amplify and uplift that, investing in what the communities are already working with and addressing their needs, asking what they actually need locally. And I think that taps into this excellent point that Dr. Prem raised about local knowledge, about the importance of recognizing that your community members are your experts and the ways that they are addressing their needs on a day-to-day basis are the kinds of things you need to be asking about, as where to be able to help them with the supports that they need, that they're requesting, and to be aware that we're not talking about an even playing field here. And so when we're talking about supporting preparedness or supporting communities through recovery, recognizing that there are some folks who monopolize the mic, who monopolize resources in communities, and that's not, that every option isn't available to every community. So when we work with Black community members, we need to be asking them what barriers they're encountering and anticipating that there will be those barriers, and asking what support they need to navigate around those, to eliminate those, whatever is in our power as the person in a decision-making role or in a support role, because we're not talking about an even set of access to resources and supports. So just having that level of awareness, of appreciation for the expertise of local people, and then uplifting the systems that they're already using to support themselves on a day-to-day basis.
Thank you, Dr. Campbell. And so I will share a few things. So number one, what I will say is content versus context experts, which is what folks have been talking about in emergency management. There's an attitude in the field itself that the emergency manager is the ultimate expert and everyone should just do what they tell them to do and the world would just be a better place. Except the reality, and they think that they have control over things that they don't have control over. So there's this illusion of control that they try to bring through response and recovery, mostly response in parts of recovery. And so making sure that we're getting out of that traditional way of thinking in emergency management and pushing the field to understand that you are a content expert. You know the stuff on paper, you know the stuff in books, you know how to organize stuff, you know how to do the plans, you know how to make sure that the stuff gets to the places and the organizations that need to be involved for the most part, for some of the part, are involved. But ultimately, none of that is going to work without context. Plans don't work without context. The way you structure yourself doesn't work without context. The way that you do preparedness, response, and recovery does not work without that context expertise, and community members are the context experts. And it is not enough to say that you have a relationship with one Black person in a community or one Black organization in a community to be able to say that you have the perspective on the Black community, because there are many perspectives, there are many organizations, and you have to understand all of the nuances. So that's number one. I would say number two is the same tools that are both unintentionally and intentionally causing harm to Black communities are the same tools and impacts that are impacting them. Let me reframe. The same tools and approaches that are causing harm when there's a disaster and post-disaster. So the zoning and codes of a jurisdiction, the same ways they try to keep us out of communities is the same way after disasters, where those same concepts are applied to get us out of communities. And so we have to be aware of all of the different ways that this is connected to the day-to-day realities. Healthcare, for example, we have a number of places where it's hard to get access to good quality healthcare. That has direct implications on what's going to happen after a disaster. You can expect that there will be high incidence of chronic illnesses that kind of step outside of the manageable, controllable area for families. You can expect that folks will not be able to fully engage in the approaches that the traditional emergency management and VOAD structures put out there for people to access resources, right? We know these things to be true based on everything that everyone has said here today. We know that in the recovery phase that there's a cap, in this, I will give them credit. This is, I attribute this to the Center for Disaster Philanthropy's webinar they did on disaster case management. But there's this traditional disaster case management that is kind of about FEMA and making sure folks get access to those resources. Then there's the lowercase d, disaster case management, which really is about the long-term things that community organizations are helping the community members with after a disaster that go well beyond what FEMA is going to offer, or what the SBA, whether or not they get approved for the SBA loan after a disaster. So this idea of making sure that our communities, community-based organizations have capacity, the knowledge, investments to be able to actually help their communities for the long term. Because when we're talking about recovery, and we haven't explicitly said this, you're talking about months to years. Sometimes you're talking about a decade before a community has kind of gotten some semblance of stability, and revitalized in a way that makes sense for what their vision for their community is. And so with that context, you have to have community-based organizations involved, and really in a leadership role, in these processes, from how we do plans for how we prepare communities, to how we do response and recovery. And then the last thing I'll say is, one of the experiences that really has, well, I should say there are many experiences that have influenced my logic and thinking for focusing on Black people. And the first one is that it's uncomfortable for a lot of Black people to focus on Black people. That sounds weird, y'all, but it is true. You'll hear folks have organizations and they're like, oh, we serve everybody. But it's a Black-led organization. And if you talk to them on the side, they might tell you that, yeah, our focus is on Black people. But in absence of being in these official rooms, explicitly naming that the challenges Black communities are dealing with because of anti-Black racism and how that plays out in day-to-day life and what's happening after disasters, their needs are not actually brought to the forefront. And if we're talking about kind of advocating for what we deserve, it's hard to do that if no one is explicitly naming the group that they're advocating for. And the other piece to that is, there's just a lot of misperceptions about Black people in communities. So we oftentimes think of Black urban, you live in a quote unquote, what they like to call a ghetto. But in reality, if you look at the Pew Research study that was done, I believe it was a few years back, where they surveyed Black people all across the country, say, well, where do you live? It turns out that about 40% of us live in urban environments, and about 39% of us live in suburban environments, and about 20% of us, a little over 20% of us, live in rural areas. So even how we think about the ways that we target our resources, and that we're also focusing on the most vulnerable in our communities, and that the folks who are most vulnerable are also a part of how we're engaging and learning, because just because we're Black, we don't know everything about what people are dealing with, even if we grew up poor, even if we're currently poor, that there's all these different nuances. So I'm going to stop there and just say thank you to everyone for joining us today. We used all of our time. I just want to give an incredible shout out to Joe Gilliam, to Dr. Prim, to Dr. Campbell for being here with us today. If you have links, I was just about to say that you got all up in there, Mr. Gilliam, drop those links in the chat. So for Unity and Disasters, the best way for people to support you, for All Healers Mental Health Alliance, what are the links that you want people to go to? For the Bill Anderson Fund, what links do you want people to go to? And so we recorded this. So what we'll do is, a part of the release of the recording is we'll also include those links that you put in the chat, or that you share with me afterwards. And lastly, I want to thank all the folks who attended. We know that this is not a common topic. We know that we're working to expand conversations around these issues and help people see how it's connected to the day-to-day realities and situations. So thank you for taking the time to be here with us on this journey. If you have questions or comments, I apologize that we ran out of time, but please feel free. I'm going to stay on for a little while. to drop those in the chat or use the question and answer feature. And we can do a follow-up where we really get to the nitty-gritty of some of those questions or thoughts that you have. So happy Thursday, everyone. Have an amazing rest of the day. And please visit blackresiliencenetwork.org, and we'll see you soon.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. This is great. Appreciate
Wonderful
it.